Today, doing something a little different, gonna talk about my technique and how to hold a consistent bevel angle. Gonna be working on a Nubatama 1K bamboo stone. This is the 1K gold stone, and this is a Richmond Artifex AEB-L steel. It's an orange G10 handle. Pretty nice little knife here. When I sharpen, I use pretty basic techniques. If you ever look on a old box that contains water stones, something like King brand usually, you'll see on the back it has a very basic description of hold a knife at a 45-degree angle and move back and forth. To that side, move back and forth. And while that's great, it really doesn't teach you anything beyond that. A lot of people have troubles with holding consistency in the bevel, and I did too for a long time until I discovered that through applying pressure in different areas you can basically have the knife follow its own curve as you pass it along the stone. And the way I do this is I start out with a little pressure in a twisting form into the stone with the blade. So it's a little rolling action from my wrist right here. And what that does is that plants the bevel on the stone, so that when you bring the knife down the stone, it follows along its own curvature. Even up through the belly and into the tip area of the blade, which is a common trouble area for a lot of people. Now this is great to keep consistency in the bevel and to make things nice and even, but it can be difficult even on a blade of this size, or if you want to grind quickly, which often requires more pressure. If you try and use too much pressure, especially while going one-handed with this technique, you start to flex the blade, and when you flex the blade over this surface, you're only hitting in sporadic spots. You'll notice a lot of people like to flatten out their water stones and make sure it's nice and flat. Well, while that's good and all, it does help a little bit to an extent. It really doesn't make the biggest of difference because your blade is not perfectly flat, and your contact area is not the whole width of the stone at any one time. Your contact points are very thin, maybe only the thickness of the spine as you go along the stone, and you can see this by the track marks left on your stones when you're sharpening. Due to this, when you sharpen, you'll often see me put my fingers on the blade like this and move down the edge as I sharpen. And what that does is that's applying specific pressure onto the edge. So I am following in a very thin line, pinpointing the pressure all the way up and down the edge. As I go with my back and forth stroke, I go this way, then overlap back, and overlap back, continue until I get to the tip of the blade. And then often at the end of that, I'll finish off some very long, even strokes across the stone to make sure the grind pattern is nice and even across the edge. So that's the basics of my technique and holding consistency in the bevel, is you just want to focus the forces that you're applying to the blade on the edge and the edge itself. Kind of take and separate this edge from the whole rest of the knife and just imagine that edge laying on the stone. It's kind of be a triangle shape laying on the stone. And the bevel plane, the side that is laying on the stone, you want it to make as even contact at all times as possible. So by giving a little twisting in the blade to hold it there and supporting it with your fingers, pinpointing the pressure along the edge, and then grind the edge very precisely from the tip to the heel on each side. Now for some of those more traditional type sharpening strokes. And in that case, I'm just leaving my fingers in the center, and that's just to help to keep the blade from wobbling like that as I go down the stone. When I am making those back and forth passes like that, I'm just using light pressure. I'm just trying to even out the grind pattern, make sure I have consistency in the edge. When you do these strokes like this, if you use that type of method, you kind of want to aim from the corners of the stone so that your stroke crosses in a big X pattern across the stone like that. Alright, so I think we're pretty good on this stone. Burrs at a minimal. That is really sharp coming off this stone. I'm really impressed by that. It's not a, it might shave. We can check at that. And it does take off some hair, which is good. But it's a rather coarse edge. It does pretty well at slicing newsprint. So from here, I'm going to take and make the jump to my 5K Nubatama bamboo stone. It's a little bit big of a jump, but it's doable, and I'll explain that in just a second. Just had to get the stone cleaned off. It was a little dirty from last use. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to end up polishing this whole bevel with this stone, but I'm going to concentrate more towards the apex of the bevel, kind of creating a slight micro to it. And the reason I'm going to do that is because if I wanted to polish this whole bevel, I'd probably need to use a stone in between to get all the scratches out properly. This will give the surface a nice luster, but at the edge, because there's going to be a smaller point of contact, the stone will abrade that area a little easier and actually produce a solid 5K edge, while the rest of the bevel will just be slightly polished. You may notice the spine is a little higher from the stone, increasing the angle just a little bit. In the end, this bevel is going to be a little bit convex because I move up and down with the angle as I sharpen. Often you'll hear, I've even described it myself as, when you're sharpening a knife like this and you get to the belly and the tip area, you want to raise the handle just ever so slightly so that the knife curves up into the tip. Another way to kind of imagine this odd rolling that needs to happen for you to get into a curved area of a blade is it's a kind of a U shape on the stone. This will happen a lot more with a very curved knife where the edge from the heel to the tip is one continuous arc and doesn't have a flat area like this blade does. And when you deal with a blade like that, you got to start right at the very heel, and you have to work from the heel all the way to the tip and back. And when you do so, it'll be a very U-shaped motion like this as you go back and forth on the stone. Just a little something to remember as you deal with blades that have less and less of a straight belly to them, or less and less of a straight rear portion of the blade. When the rear portion of the blade has just as much curve as the front portion of the blade, then you have to advance your technique a little bit to compensate for that. Okay, I'm going to try and work up a little mud on the stone. The stone's really hard, and when you have a stone like that, it often can be to your advantage to work up a little mud on its surface. It will help the stone cut a little faster, and that will really help out right now because we're making such a large jump from the 1K to the 5K. Something I have noticed with the new Atomic Bamboo 1K Goldstone is that it's a little bit coarser than, say, like my Urishiyama 6K or 1K. It definitely leaves a little coarser of a scratch pattern and thus grinds a little quicker, but also takes a little bit more working on some of the stones to get the scratch pattern to equate when you're moving up. So we'll see how this forming of a little mud on the surface helps us out. As you notice, when I sharpen, a lot of the middle always stays dried because I'm moving the edge constantly through that area. Continue with the same technique. I never change it. It's always the same slight rolling pressure from the wrist and the concentrating the pressure in the areas it's needed with my free hand. This technique I found it works for everything from the straight type blades to constantly curving blades to recurve type blades, even karambit style blades. It's just all about applying the pressure, and if you apply the right amount of pressure in the right areas, the edge basically locks into the stone and follows its own natural shape. So I guess one way to say it is, how do I hold an angle? And truthfully, I don't. I just let the stone, or let the blade ride on the stone. And it's all done through just applying pressure in the right areas. Well, surprisingly, the formation of the mud has really helped to reduce the scratch pattern and created a little bit of a hazy type polish to the bevel, which I like. I've actually come to prefer that over a more lustrous polish on the bevel. I'm going to add a little bit of water there, which basically ruined the mud that I had on the surface, but it's alright. We're done using that mud for right now. So I need to kind of flush the surface off. It's got a little grit on there that I didn't want. Once again, little fuzzies from the towels or just something you picked up on your hand can get on the stone while you're sharpening and cause little scratches you don't want. So you always want to keep your surface clean and keep it flushed when possible. burr is reduced quite well. One of the rings here. Test this level of sharpness on some newsprint here. Now this edge is going to be a 5K edge, but it's going to be a little more toothy. It's going to have a little more bite, which is something you kind of want with a blade like this. Does more slicing activities. Although it will cut through newsprint. Oops. Slice it just effortlessly. It does work better with a slicing action than a push. Push cut not working so well, where a slice cleanly cuts through. It also, it's non-directional. It'll slice equally well in both directions. So, there it is, my technique and how I hold consistency in a bevel, and also the finished sharpening of a Richmond Artifex by me. So if you have any questions, please post them in the comments section below.